Welcome to a deep dive into the world of mold. It seems like mold is everywhere these days, and everyone's got a scary mold story. So we're going to take all this research that you've provided and cut through all the hype. And really, we're going to find out the truth about mold.
It's interesting. With all the attention that mold gets, there's still so much confusion about what it actually is and just how dangerous different types of mold can be.
And that's exactly why we're here. Separating fact from fiction so you can make smart decisions about any potential mold issues you might be dealing with.
Yeah, one of the first things we need to get rid of is that idea that all mold is the same,
All
is
right.
equally dangerous. The research you gave us breaks mold down into four categories.
Okay, so we've got cosmetic, allergenic, pathogenic, and toxic. Kind of a lot to wrap your head around.
It might seem like a lot, but once you kind of get the basics of each one, it helps you to see what the real risks actually are.
So let's start with cosmetic mold. What exactly is that?
Cosmetic mold is kind of like that house guest that just won't leave. Not necessarily harmful, but it's not pretty to look at. And it might be a sign that there's something else going on that you can't see.
Oh, so like a little fuzzy warning sign.
Exactly. The research even mentioned that even if you think it's just cosmetic, you should still see if there's any hidden moisture because that dampness could be a breeding ground for some of the more serious types of mold.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Leading us right into our next category.
Yeah.
Allergenic mold. Now, this is the one that makes most people think of, sniffles and sneezes, but your research suggests it goes way beyond that.
Yeah, for sure. People with mold allergies will have those classic symptoms like congestion and itchy eyes, but allergenic mold can trigger some pretty serious conditions too.
Like what kinds of conditions?
Well, the research gives the example of allergic rhinitis. It's a chronic condition that can cause persistent nasal issues, mess with your sleep, even increase your risk for sinus infections. So, if you've got that runny nose that just won't quit, mold could be why.
Yeah, that's no fun at all. Now, I know you're worried about asthma and your research backs that up.
Definitely. The research is very clear that common indoor molds can be asthma triggers and can cause wheezing, coughing, difficulty breathing, all those scary asthma symptoms.
Yeah, definitely something to be aware of. Now, there's also this other condition that was mentioned in your research, hypersensitivity pneumonitis. It sounds pretty scary.
It is a serious condition, but thankfully not very common. Basically, it's an inflammatory lung disease that's triggered by breathing in certain particles, including stuff from mold. And what's really kind of worrisome is that water-cooled AC systems can spread these particles throughout a whole building.
So it's not just about what you can see, but what's actually in the air.
Yeah.
It's a great point. Now, we can't forget about aspergillosis, which, if I'm understanding this correctly, can actually be fatal.
Yeah, unfortunately. It's caused by exposure to a specific type of mold called Aspergillus, and it can be really dangerous for people with lung conditions. So you or anyone you know who might have a compromised respiratory system needs to be really, really careful about mold exposure.
And the research didn't hold back on the consequences either. It talked about how it starts with inflammation, but can lead to coughing up blood, chest pain, even organ damage.
Absolutely. And it's important to stress that it can be fatal if it's not caught and treated early. So, we've covered cosmetic and allergenic mold, but we're not done yet. We're going to dive into pathogenic mold and then the infamous mycotoxins. And that's where things get really interesting.
All right, so we've talked about the molds that make your body react, but what about the ones that actually infect you? Those pathogenic molds, they sound pretty intense.
They are. We talked about allergenic molds causing the immune system to like overreact, but these pathogenic molds are different. They're like little invaders that actually get inside you and start growing.
Okay, yeah, that's a little unsettling. And the research you provided actually broke those pathogenic molds down into two different types, primary and opportunistic.
Right. To kind of understand the difference, you can think about a fortress. Primary pathogens, they're like a well-trained army. They can just bust right through the defenses of even the strongest fortresses, meaning they can infect healthy people.
So these are the heavy hitters of the mold world. Are there any examples of these primary pathogens?
Yeah, the research mentioned a couple with pretty intimidating names, coccidioids and histoplasma. But the point is they're a direct threat whether you're healthy or not.
Okay, so what about the opportunistic pathogens? Are they less dangerous?
Well, think of these opportunistic pathogens more like a sneaky force. They wait for like a weakness in the fortress walls, and they take the opportunity to attack when the immune system is already weak, like when someone is sick or recovering from surgery or maybe on certain medications.
So they're kind of waiting for their chance to slip in when your body's defenses are down. The research mentioned some examples of these too, right?
Yeah, it specifically calls out Aspergillus fumigatus and Candida albicans. You might recognize Candida as the culprit behind yeast infections.
Oh, wow. I never knew Candida was actually a mold. So this just emphasizes how careful we need to be about mold, especially if we have a weakened immune system.
Exactly. Now, there's one type of mold we haven't gotten to yet. The one everyone's afraid of. The one that's surrounded by a ton of misinformation. Toxic mold.
Ah, yes, the infamous toxic mold. I've got to admit, I've been pretty curious about this part of our little deep dive.
Yeah, well, the important thing to remember is that toxic mold isn't actually a type of mold itself. It's a term that we use to describe molds that produce something called mycotoxins.
Mycotoxins. It's like the really bad stuff, right? The research even compared it to chemical warfare agents.
Yeah, it defined mycotoxins as secondary metabolites produced by microfungi that are capable of causing disease and death in humans and other animals. And you're right, some of these mycotoxins are so potent that they've even been considered for use as chemical warfare agents, just because they can really disrupt the way your body works.
That's kind of scary. So it's not the mold itself that's toxic, but these mycotoxins that it makes. And another thing that surprised me, the research said that not all toxic mold is black.
That's right. There's this big misconception that only black mold is dangerous, but that's just not true. Mold color comes from the type of spores it makes, not how toxic it is. And you can have molds of all colors that produce mycotoxins.
So you can't just go by color to tell if a mold is dangerous. Which brings us to Stachybotrys chartarum, the one that everyone calls black mold, the one that makes headlines all the time.
Yeah, this is actually a case where the media hype and the science kind of match up. Stachybotrys chartarum is a really common and really dangerous type of toxic mold.
The research listed a bunch of health problems it can cause. Everything from skin and eye infections to neurological damage and even liver cancer. It's pretty terrifying stuff.
It is. The range of health issues is definitely alarming. And to really show you how serious it is, the research actually has this historical story about its toxicity.
Oh, what's that?
Well, back in the 1920s, there were reports of horses and cattle dying from eating moldy hay. And it turned out that hay was contaminated with Stachybotrys. It goes to show how bad these mycotoxins can be.
Wow. So these mycotoxins sound super dangerous. How do they actually work? What makes them so hard to get rid of?
Well, mycotoxins are kind of like little saboteurs. They go around your body and cause all kinds of problems. They can affect almost every organ system, and they can have similar effects to neurotoxins. The research you provided said that 70% of people with confirmed exposure to toxic mold have symptoms of neurotoxicity. It's a huge number of people.
Neurotoxicity, what does that look like?
Well, we're talking about things like trouble thinking clearly, memory problems, mood swings, even seizures. And what's even scarier is that these mycotoxins can get into your brain not only through your nose, but through your eyes, too.
Wait, your eyes. So even if you're wearing a mask to protect yourself, you could still be getting these toxins in through your eyes.
That's right. It's something that people often don't think about, especially if they're trying to clean up mold themselves. You could be putting yourself at risk without even knowing it.
So if these mycotoxins are so strong and hard to kill, how do we actually get rid of them? I mean, will regular cleaning products work?
Sadly, no. Mycotoxins are incredibly tough. The research you gave us says they can survive temperatures up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And they're not bothered by things like bleach or acid. There was even a story about spores from 2 million-year-old rocks that could still grow.
Wow, they're like the superheroes of the mold world. It sounds like we're dealing with something almost impossible to destroy.
They're incredibly resilient, that's for sure. And that's exactly why we need to stress the importance of getting professional help when you're dealing with possible toxic mold.
So no more trying to just clean it up with a bottle of bleach and hope for the best.
I wouldn't advise it. Not only is it probably not going to work, but you could be putting yourself in danger. It's not just about getting rid of the mold you can see. It's about dealing with the mycotoxins that you can't see.
Right, because as we learned earlier, even the common toxic molds don't always produce mycotoxins. It depends on a lot of different things in the environment.
Exactly. So if you think you might have a problem with toxic mold, the very first thing you should do is call a professional. They can look at the situation and decide what needs to be done.
So DIY is definitely out when it comes to toxic mold. What's the first step to getting professional help?
Well, it goes back to what we said earlier. Not all mold is the same. Knowing exactly what type of mold you're dealing with is super important.
So even if it looks like black mold, it might not actually be making those dangerous mycotoxins.
Yeah. Right. The research really stressed that even common toxic molds like Stachybotrys don't always produce mycotoxins. What it grows on, the temperature, how humid it is, even things we don't completely understand yet can all affect whether it's producing those bad substances.
So just looking at it isn't enough. You really need to get it tested professionally to know for sure.
Exactly. A professional can take samples, look at them under a microscope, and figure out exactly what kind of mold it is and whether it's making mycotoxins.
This makes me think back to how tough those mycotoxins are.
Hmm.
If they can handle extreme temperatures and harsh chemicals, how do professionals actually get rid of them?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. Getting rid of mold often involves a lot of different things, like containing the area where the mold is, removing materials that are contaminated, and thoroughly cleaning with special products that are designed to neutralize those mycotoxins.
It sounds like a complicated and probably expensive process.
It can be, but when you're talking about protecting your health, it's an investment worth considering.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? I think the biggest takeaway here is that mold is a lot more than just something that looks bad. It's a complex issue that comes with a lot of potential health risks that we can't ignore.
I agree, and one of the most important things to remember is that knowledge is power. You know a lot more now about different types of mold, the real risks involved, and how important it is to get professional help when you might have toxic mold.
We've busted some myths, talked about the science behind mold and mycotoxins, and hopefully given you the tools to deal with this topic with a little bit of caution and a lot more information. It sounds like don't freak out, but don't ignore it, right? Call an expert.
Absolutely. They can really figure out what's going on, what kind of mold it is, and how bad it really is.
And I'm guessing that professional look is super important when we're talking about those mycotoxins.
You got it. Remember, just because you see something that looks like black mold, it doesn't mean it's making those mycotoxins. And sometimes molds that look totally fine might actually be the ones producing that harmful stuff.
So we really can't tell just by looking, huh? Getting it professionally tested is the only way to know for sure.
Exactly. Better safe than sorry. Right. Get a real answer.
Now, before we finish up our deep dive here, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about mycotoxins being able to like crazy temperatures and harsh chemicals.
Mhm.
It really makes you think, if they're that tough, shouldn't we be changing how we think about water damage and preventing mold in the first place?
That's a great point. We always focus on cleaning up the mold we see, but what about those mycotoxins we can't see?
Right, like we need to be more proactive, not just reactive.
Exactly. Knowing how strong those mycotoxins are and how they can affect our health, it's even more important to stop the mold from growing at all.
So what can people do? How can they make their homes and workplaces less friendly to mold?
Well, your research actually had some good tips. Controlling humidity is key. So using a dehumidifier in damp areas and making sure there's good ventilation can make a big difference.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Fixing leaks right away is huge. Even a tiny leak can be all the mold needs to get started.
So like, leaky faucets, pipes, roofs, things like that.
Right, and don't forget about the sneaky sources of moisture, condensation on windows, or even spills that haven't dried completely.
It's all about keeping an eye out for moisture and doing what we can to keep things dry.
Exactly. And remember, if you do see mold, don't try to be a hero. Call a pro who can get rid of it safely.
This has been a really amazing deep dive. I feel like I've gone from being scared and confused about mold to feeling a lot more confident and informed.
That's great to hear. Remember, knowledge is the best way to fight fear and misinformation.
As we wrap up, there's this one question that's stuck in my mind. We've talked about mycotoxins and how they can affect the brain. So I'm wondering if there are any long-term studies that look at what happens when people are exposed to low levels of mycotoxins over a long period of time.
That's a really interesting question and definitely something worth looking into more. I'm curious to see what research comes out about that in the future.
Me too. Well, thanks for taking us on this journey into the world of mold. I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did too.
My pleasure. And remember, if you have any more questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. We're always here to help you understand this fascinating and sometimes, yes, a little scary topic.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time, stay curious and stay mold-free.